The dinner had been planned weeks in advance. A gathering of old friends, partners, colleagues. The kind of evening where everything looks perfect on the surface. Polished silverware, laughter bubbling through the air, a string quartet murmuring in the corner. Alain sat opposite André. Between them, a single candle trembled, its flame stretching and shrinking with every breath, every laugh, every hesitation that filled the room. To anyone else, they were simply two men in suits, exchanging polite conversation across the table. But in that narrow space between the candle and their glances lived a secret neither dared to speak aloud. André's wife was telling a story, something about a trip to Lyon. Alain's hand rested near his wine glass, his fingers tracing the stem slowly, rhythmically, as if he were counting heartbeats. He nodded at her words, but his eyes, those careful, intelligent eyes, never left André's. André smiled back, the smallest curve of a mouth trained to remain neutral. The kind of smile that could pass unnoticed by the rest of the world, yet set something ablaze between them. Oh yes, that's when I met him. He was outside in front of a grand building at night. His face was pointed skyward. He had a cigarette between his lips. That handsome face, those lips, I shall never forget them. He seemed happy but terribly sad all at once. It had started months ago, perhaps even years before either of them could admit it. A moment after work, a shared cigarette on a rainy street, a silence that felt like confession, and then, as always, retreat. Now under the golden light of the dining room, surrounded by laughter and crystal, everything felt unbearable. The candle flickered again, and in that trembling light, they both seemed to waver. Two men trapped between what they wanted and what the world allowed them to have. The dinner went on. Toasts were made. Glasses chimed. André's wife touched his arm. Alain looked away. But just before the dessert was served, their eyes met one last time. A long, wordless exchange, heavy with everything that would never be said. When the candle finally died out, so did the moment. Yet somewhere, in the quiet between their lives, the echo of that flame still burned. Night had taken the city. The Seine shimmered like a dark mirror, trembling with the reflections of the bridges and the lamps along its banks. The air smelled of wine, rain, and fallen leaves. The guests were leaving the restaurant. Soft laughter, farewells, the click of heels on whetstone. Alain and André's wives climbed into the waiting car, still talking about the evening. "Are you coming?" one of them asked. André shook his head lightly. "We'll walk a bit," he said, smiling just enough. The car drove away, leaving behind a ribbon of perfume and a trail of red tail light fading into the mist. Silence fell. They walked side by side, their steps even, the distance between them precisely measured, as if the whole night depended on not touching. "It was a good evening," Alain said at last, his voice low. "Yes," André replied. "Very good." They both smiled too quickly. Then came a quiet, stifled laugh, the kind people use to hide something they can't afford to show. The wind gathered the leaves and spun them around their shoes. Paris seemed to be holding its breath, watching. At the corner of a narrow street, André stopped walking. "You know," he murmured, not looking at him, "I still think about that night." Alain's breath caught. "So do I," he said, their shoulders brushed. A spark, barely there, but it burned all the same. For a heartbeat, the air between them became something alive, fragile, dangerous. They reached the river. The wind was colder here. The reflections of the city trembled on the dark water like secrets too heavy to stay still. André took his hand from his pocket. His fingers brushed Alain's, briefly, almost by accident, but in that single instant, it felt like a confession, a vow, and a goodbye all at once. Then he withdrew it. Silence again. Deeper this time, but gentler too. They walked until the fog swallowed their shapes completely. Under the streetlights, their shadows met and parted again, over and over, just as they always would. The rain had followed them all the way from the river. By the time they reached the café, the city was blurred, a watercolor of light and shadow melting into itself. André didn't speak. He only glanced once over his shoulder, then pushed open the door to the narrow stairwell behind the café. The air smelled of coffee and rain-soaked stone. Each step creaked, each heartbeat louder than the last. The room was small, hidden, the kind you rent for a single night and forget by morning. A single lamp burned weakly beside the bed. Outside, the city hummed in its sleep. Alain closed the door. For a long moment, neither moved. He could hear André breathing, slow, uncertain, the sound of someone fighting a war inside his chest. Their eyes met, and the air between them thickened, like honey and smoke. "You shouldn't have come," André whispered. "I already did," Alain replied softly. And that was the end of pretending. The distance between them disappeared. André reached out first, his hand trembling before it found the side of Alain's face. It was a touch heavy with restraint, not lust, but the ache of everything forbidden. Alain leaned into it, closing his eyes as if that single gesture might save him from the world. Outside, thunder rolled distantly over Paris, and then their lips met, not with the hunger of youth, but with the reverence of two men who knew the cost of every second. The rain grew louder, a wild percussion against the window, drowning out the noise of guilt and time. Later, when the lamp had dimmed and their words had become nothing more than whispers in the dark, André lay still, tracing invisible shapes on Alain's skin. "What happens now?" he asked. Alain smiled faintly, though his heart felt heavy. "Now," he said, "we forget, and remember forever." The rain eased. Somewhere below, a door closed, a bottle broke, the world moved on. But in that small room above the café, two men remained, caught in a moment that refused to end. It had been several weeks since that night. Time, obedient and cruel, had carried them back into their separate lives. The dinners, the obligations, the ordinary conversations that now felt like masks. André hadn't seen Alain since. But when he received the invitation, a gallery opening in Saint-Germain, he somehow knew Alain would be there. The room was white and bright, full of voices, clinking glasses, and the soft rustle of expensive clothing. Paintings hung along the walls, landscapes, portraits, abstractions. None of it seemed to matter. André moved slowly through the crowd, his hand resting lightly on the small of his wife's back, his smile effortless, practiced. Every few minutes he glanced toward the doorway, and then he saw him. Alain, standing near a painting of two figures beneath a storm, their faces turned away from each other. He looked older, somehow. Not in years, but in the way a man looks when he's spent too long trying to forget something unforgettable. Their eyes met across the room. The noise around them faded to a blur. A woman nearby was describing the painting's composition. Two men separated by wind, and yet the same horizon, she said. André's heart gave a single painful beat. Alain smiled faintly, the kind of smile one gives at a distance, polite, practiced, but hiding everything. André returned it, his throat tightening. Their wives spoke briefly, polite chatter about the art, the weather, mutual friends. The men stood in silence beside them, two ghosts wearing suits. At one point, Alain stepped closer, under the pretense of reaching for a glass of champagne. Their sleeves brushed. It was nothing, a whisper of contact, but André felt it like lightning. Beautiful work, Alain murmured, eyes still on the painting. André nodded. Yes, he said softly. Almost too beautiful. Then came the small pause, the one that always held the truth neither could speak. The evening went on, laughter, applause, introductions. The world resumed its rhythm. But as Alain left, coat folded neatly over his arm, he passed by André and whispered, almost too quietly to hear, "Do you still walk by the river?" André froze. His answer came out like a breath. Every night. Their eyes met once more, and then Alain was gone, leaving behind the faintest trace of cologne, the echo of rain against glass, and a truth that no painting could contain. Time passed, as it always does, quietly, without asking permission. The world changed its seasons, the bridges aged, and the cafes along the Seine filled with new laughter, new stories. André grew older in the way men do when they have learned to live without what they truly wanted. Gracefully, politely, with eyes that looked away too quickly. He kept his life neat, predictable. Dinners, work, the theater, a garden in the country. He never spoke Alain's name aloud. Sometimes, in the evenings, he would find himself standing by the window, a glass of wine in hand, staring at the faint reflection of his own face. Outside, the street lamps glowed like memories that refused to die. He would imagine Alain somewhere, perhaps at another dinner table, surrounded by laughter, pretending just as he did. And in that imagining, they were both younger again. The candle still burned between them. The world was still asleep. One winter, André visited a small gallery near Montparnasse. He had no reason to be there, or perhaps he did. On a far wall hung a painting, two figures standing apart under a storm. The same image from years ago, but this one different. Softer, sadder. At the bottom, written faintly in pencil, a dedication. Pour A, sous la pluie, toujours. 4A, beneath the rain, always. Andre stood there a long time, his throat tightened. The years between them, all the silences, the restraint, the careful forgetting, collapsed into a single heartbeat. He smiled, the smallest, most human smile, and whispered, "Always." Outside it began to rain. He didn't open his umbrella. He walked home slowly through the glistening streets of Paris, and for the first time in years, he felt alive again. Paris some years later. The years had settled around Andre like dust on old books, soft, inevitable. He had learned how to smile in public again, how to talk about the weather and politics without feeling the ground shift beneath him. But some mornings, when the light entered his study just so pale and tender, like that first dawn they once shared, he felt the ache return. It was a quiet day in March when he found the letters. He had been sorting through a drawer of old correspondence, tax forms, invitations, theater programs. Beneath them all lay a small bundle tied with a silk ribbon. The paper had yellowed at the edges, but the handwriting, Alain's, was unmistakable. He sat down slowly, heart pounding. The letters were never sent. Andre, tonight. The city feels like glass, fragile, reflecting too much. I walked by the river again, the same bench, the same lamplight. I almost expected to see you there. Do you ever pass by that place and wonder if the air still remembers us? Andre traced the words with his thumb. There were 4 letters in all, written over years, each one beginning with restraint and ending in confession. In one, Alain spoke of a new posting in Brussels, how he kept pretending he had chosen it for career reasons. In another, he described a dream, a dinner, the candle burning, Andre's voice calling his name before the flame went out. And the last letter, written just 2 years before Alain's death, was the simplest. If there is a heaven, I hope it looks like that night by the river. Nothing grand. Just us, walking, pretending not to love each other. Andre folded the papers carefully and placed them back inside the drawer. He didn't cry. He only sat there, surrounded by silence. The same silence that had always been theirs. Later that evening, he walked down to the Seine. The river was still there, dark and slow, reflecting the city's new lights. He stood by the same stone railing, hands in his pockets, and whispered, "Bonsoir, mon ami." The wind stirred as if in reply, and for the first time in years, Andre smiled without sadness. Spring, 1983. It was the first warm day of the year, the kind of Paris afternoon that makes the city shimmer with forgiveness. Andre sat at a small café on Rue Bonaparte, reading the paper without really seeing it. He had become something of a quiet fixture in the neighborhood, a retired man with impeccable manners, always dressed neatly, always alone. That was when he approached him. André looked up. A young man stood before him, no more than 22. He wore a corduroy jacket and carried a sketchbook under his arm. His hair fell into his eyes. "Excuse me," he said in careful French. "You're Monsieur Laurent, yes? You were a friend of the painter Alain Duval?" He looked up, startled. The name hit him like a forgotten melody. "Yes," he said, "a long time ago." The young man introduced himself. Julien Marchand, a student at the École des Beaux-Arts. He had been researching forgotten queer artists of mid-century France, and Alain's name kept appearing. Never in books, but in footnotes, gallery inventories, and private letters. "I found correspondence," Julien said softly. "Drafts he never sent. They mentioned someone named A. I think that was you." André's throat tightened. He forced a smile. He always had a way of saying too much without ever saying it. They spoke for over an hour. Julien's enthusiasm was unfiltered but kind. He spoke of Alain's final works, now being quietly rediscovered, haunting canvases of two male figures painted in muted golds and silvers, always just out of reach. When Julien asked what Alain had been like, he answered simply, "He painted like he loved, quietly, completely, and as if it were a sin." Brussels, 1975, years earlier. He had grown tired of cities, of pretending. The flat in Brussels was bare except for an easel and a window facing the grey river. Alain painted every day, not for galleries, but for himself, for the man he could not write to anymore. Some days he painted landscapes, bridges over mist, candlelit dinners turned into abstractions of gold and shadow. Other days he painted only hands, two men's hands almost touching, never quite meeting. In his final years, his work became something like prayer, each brush stroke a confession. He once wrote in his journal, "Love, when forbidden, does not die. It transforms. It hides inside art, inside silence, inside color." He died quietly one winter morning, the unfinished canvas still wet. Two figures walking through fog, their shadows touching where their hands could not. Later that night after Julien left, André walked to the Seine again. He stood where they had once stood, the lamps flickering gold in the distance. He imagined Alain there, paint on his fingers, smiling faintly in that way he always did when he was trying not to say too much. "Your art found its way back," André whispered. "You did." The wind off the water stirred his coat, cool and soft, like a familiar hand resting on his shoulder. And for a fleeting second, André could almost hear Alain's voice behind him. "Then so have you." The museum basement smelled of dust and turpentine, the ghosts of 100 forgotten artists whispering in silence. Julien had spent weeks cataloging anonymous works from a private collection recently donated to the city. The crates bore faded labels, many from Brussels, dated in the 1970s. He was tired, covered in flecks of varnish and chalk, when he saw it. a canvas wrapped in brown paper, unsigned. The handwriting on the label read simply, Hiver sans nom, winter without a name. He unwrapped it slowly. The surface shimmered under the dim light. A winter landscape, but almost abstract. Two figures walked through fog toward a river, familiar shapes rendered in layers of gray, white, and gold. Between them, a small glimmer, a candle, or perhaps the last trace of daylight. Julian's chest tightened. He had seen this before, not this exact painting, but its spirit, in sketches, in fragments, in the unfinished works Alain Duval had left behind. He leaned closer. There, hidden beneath the paint, faint but unmistakable, were the outlines of two faces overlapping, transparent as smoke, Alain's and another man's. And on the lower edge, nearly erased, were words written into the paint itself, in the smallest script imaginable, Pour A.L. à jamais, for A.L. forever. Julien sat back, trembling. He whispered the name aloud. André Laurent. He realized then that this wasn't just a painting. It was a confession, a love letter written in color, meant for one man, buried for decades beneath time and shame. That evening, Julien went to see André. He found him sitting on the terrace of the same café, the same table by the window. The older man looked up and smiled faintly when Julien arrived, as if he had been expecting him. I found it, Julien said. André didn't ask what. He only nodded once, quietly, and said, Describe it to me. Julien told him everything, the river, the fog, the faces, the hidden inscription. André listened without moving, his eyes shining. When Julien finished, there was a long silence. Then André whispered almost inaudibly,
He never forgot us. He spent his life giving life to what mattered to him most.
Julien hesitated.
He loved you, very much indeed.
André smiled sadly.
Through his art, you have given him back his voice. This is something so very special. We were never able to love when he was alive, and so the art tells a story. Our story. People take for granted the fact that they can tell each other how they feel, what they are thinking, etc. But we were never able to do that in this life.
They sat there for a long time, the city glowing gold around them. When Julien left, André reached across the table and touched his arm, not as a farewell, but as a benediction.
Promise me this, Julien. When they hang our painting in the gallery, please do not call it Winter Without a Name. Somehow, I don't think our Alain will like that very much.
Julien tilted his head.
Oh, but of course not, sir. But what do you wish me to call it?
André's smile deepened. Gentle, almost secret.
I think you should call it Sous les chandelles. That's how it all started, at a dinner table over candlelight all those years ago. He was just incredible, was Alain. An incredible painter, an incredible person. He is no longer here now. But whenever I see the beautiful flowers, or smell the rain outside, or hear those early morning birds at dawn, which he loved so very much, whenever I see his paintings, I feel his spirit.
The gallery was filled with warm light and the murmur of voices, critics, collectors, students, couples holding hands. The exhibition's title glowed softly on the wall, Sous les chandelles, the rediscovered works of Alain Duval, 1919 to 1976. Julian stood at the edge of the crowd, heart pounding. He was no longer the shy student André had met 2 years before. Tonight, he was the curator, the keeper of a story too long hidden. Behind him, the centerpiece painting, Sous les chandelles, hung beneath a single spotlight. The river, the fog, the two figures. Between them, that trembling light, once mistaken for a candle, now recognized as love itself. André sat quietly in the front row, a cane resting against his chair. He wore a dark suit, perfectly pressed, and a silver pin in the shape of a flame. His eyes were steady but wet at the corners. Julian stepped up to the podium. He looked at the audience, at all the faces waiting, curious, unknowing, and then at André, who gave him the smallest nod.
Good evening. Tonight, we gather not just to celebrate an artist, but to resurrect a truth that was never allowed to be spoken. For decades, Alain Duval's paintings were misread as studies of solitude, quiet men, distant figures, landscapes of longing. But what we now understand is that they were portraits of love, a love the world forced into silence. Art is memory that refuses to die. In his final years, Alain left us a message hidden in pigment and shadow, a message for one man. It reads, A.L. forever. André Laurent is with us this evening. He is the A.L. behind these works. He kept the story safe when it could have been lost forever. This exhibition is not only a restoration of an artist's legacy, it is an act of love, a way of saying at last what could not be said under candlelight.
Applause began slowly, then swelled until it filled the gallery. André closed his eyes. For a moment it sounded like rain on a window, like that night so long ago. He could almost feel Alain beside him again. We're seen now. When the crowd began to disperse, Julian walked over. André reached out and took his hand, the same way Alain once had.
Thank you. It was such a pleasure watching our story come to life this evening. You do so much for so many. If you ever need any more paintings for your gallery, or just someone to take coffee with, I would be very glad of the company.
Oh, Monsieur Laurent, the pleasure is all mine. He painted it, but you lived it.
The city had changed again. The cafes were fuller, the bridges busier, the laughter younger. Paris had moved on, but André had not. He was old now, his hands delicate, his hair silver and thin. Each morning, he walked the same path from his small apartment to the Seine, leaning on the same cane, pausing at the same railing where everything had once begun. He always stopped there, not to look for anyone, but to listen. The water below flowed quietly, heavy and endless. He would close his eyes and hear the echoes, footsteps on cobblestone, the flicker of candlelight, the low murmur of a voice he had not heard in decades, but could still feel against his skin. Alain had once said, "If I can't love you in life, I'll paint you in eternity." Now, eternity felt close. He had seen the exhibition many times, always quietly, after hours. The gallery kept it open for him on certain evenings, when the lights were dimmed and the city was asleep. He would sit in front of Sous les Chandelles alone, watching the painted candle flicker in silence. Sometimes he spoke to it. Sometimes he didn't have to. One evening the curator found him still there after closing, asleep in his chair, peaceful. In his lap was a folded letter. Inside, written in André's careful hand, "To whoever finds this, love doesn't die. It waits. Sometimes it waits in color, sometimes in silence, sometimes in another man's eyes across a dinner table. If someone looks at Alain's painting 100 years from now and feels something stir, a warmth, a sorrow, a memory they cannot name, let that be us. We lived quietly, but we loved loudly in our hearts, and that, I think, is enough. A.L." When the museum reopened weeks later, the letter was placed in a glass case beside the painting. Visitors read it in silence. Some smiled, some cried, and under the soft light of the gallery, Sous les Chandelles seemed to glow more than ever, as if the flame in the painting had grown stronger, not weaker, with time. That winter the Seine froze over briefly for the first time in years. At dusk, as the sun fell behind the bridges, the light scattered across the ice, shimmering gold, like hundreds of small candles burning on the river. The city carried on unaware. But somewhere between the water and the sky, two men walked side by side again, their shadows meeting at last. And this time, they did not let go.